Welcome back to the channel folks, and to another Flames of War Classics painting tutorial. Now the subject is one that you're probably not likely to paint yourselves. Let's face it folks, there's not a lot of these going around, and if there are any coming up on eBay or such like, there's going to be a bit of competition to snaffle them up. But this guide will still be quite entertaining in itself and informative, I hope, and will give you ideas around painting perhaps your own urban or rubble bases for your Flames of War units. So the Street Barricades folks, straight away you look at this and go, oh my goodness, look at all the detail they've got. Never mind the ground itself, which has got so much detail on it. You've got mattresses, chairs, you've got tarpaulins, sandbags, metal girders, wheels, doors, desks, boxes, closed boxes, open boxes, boxes with earth piled in them. There's so much, and that's quite daunting. And I've always thought to myself, that's a very daunting project to paint them. But once I sat down to do it, it turned out to be no more daunting than any other Flames of War project. Here you can see the components that are supplied with the box. You've got the two main pieces and the two removable sections. Now I've undercoated everything except the truck here with some olive brown. Used to be called olive drab, now it's called olive brown. That's going to be my shade colour for these pieces. See the truck here, by the way folks, it is definitely only, let me say, three-sided, it's not four-sided. You can't use it as a standalone piece, as a truck. You have to get it lying on its side, and you can see like the detail you've got on here folks. You see like a lamppost there and everything, you know. And here's the pieces sitting as they will for this finished subjects. Now, where am I going to start with this folks? How am I going to get started? Start with the ground. I always tend to paint from the ground up, and that includes when I talk about figures as well. You know, the deepest area first and then paint out way. So that works here. I'm going to paint the flagstones and then I'm going to paint the cobbles. So let's start the guide from there. Oh, and I apologise folks if the piece wanders off camera or out of shot at any point during this guide. I've edited it to keep that to a minimum, but it was quite tricky keeping such a long piece in the shot and in focus all the time. Starting with the flagstones then. So I'm using London Grey here, and I'm using what looks like a sort of dry brushing technique, and it's similar to it, but the brush itself is not at all dry. If you're starting to dry brush the surface when you're carrying out this process, then you need to refresh your brush and reload it. The key here is getting the paint to the right consistency so it's not too wet, so that when I'm pulling it across the surface there's no risk of it flowing, so you're therefore going into the recesses. I don't want that. I want those recesses, that olive brown, to remain as a shade. And I'm just going to stroke the brush across the surface, and I'm going to try and move the brush in the same direction each time, so that I'm going to get the impression of perhaps light coming across that surface. Don't try and do all this in one coat folks, you'll need to go back and repeat the process over the surface. Certain areas will need more precise brushwork, not the sweeping brushwork that we've been doing on the rest of the flat surface there, but try to leave some of that shade in there folks, just as we did with the broader brushstrokes. Then we're going to add a brighter layer with Panzerese Splinter Camel Base. We're going to be very careful how we put these strokes and paint the individual bricks with this colour so that we don't overdo it. We just want to highlight here, and you can see when I compare it to one that's not been highlighted, the difference between the two. Now on to some edge highlighting on the paving slabs, and apologies for the camera angle here folks, it got away from me at that point, but I'm going to be using a fine small brush and deck tan, and I'm going to start hitting the corners. I'm going to start just giving a little bit of focus to the eye for all the work we've done here, so that it will bring out the sharp corners with the bright highlight against the shade that we have left in there, the olive brown. stick to the corners here folks, and some of the edges of the slabs. For the exposed areas of earth where the slabs have been removed, I'm using German Tank Crew Highlight from Panzer Aces. It's a nice earthy brown kind of colour. Now on to the cobblestones, and I've chosen a much darker colour here than the paving slabs. Partly to make a clear distinction between the different sections of the base, but also because in my experience cobbles are really quite dark and dirty. I'm using dark grey and applying it in the same way as I did the initial coats on the paving slabs, just drawing the brush across the surface. Once again, it'll take a couple of passes to get this right, and making sure that the paint is the right consistency, so it's going to just lift off the brush onto the cobbles and not flow anywhere. We're not looking for a completely uniform surface here where every cobblestone is exactly the same shade of dark grey. Some of them can be a bit darker than others, but don't let it get too dark. It's very easy when you're doing this to get things looking very, very dark. Now that first stage was really quite a quick process. The second stage that I'm doing now is going to take you a bit longer, but it's not actually that long a process. Looking at it you'll be thinking, oh my goodness, that's going to take me all night. But honestly, on one of these pieces it maybe took me 10 minutes to do what I'm doing now, which is going through with some London Grey and just picking out a selection of the cobbles to lighten them up. Now I'm making sure that it's random but still very deliberate, in that the lighter cobbles are going to appear in a way that doesn't create a pattern but are still sufficiently evenly spaced to please the eye. Hopefully you can see how the surface is really starting to pop now, starting to come alive. You know, we're seeing, with almost no work at all really, a highly detailed cobbled surface. And I'm going to finish off with just a few slightly darker cobbles. I'm using Luftwaffe uniform for this, very blue kind of grey, and not going over the top of this because we don't want things getting too dark, but just picking out a few here and there. And we'll also be painting the exposed earth in the same way as we did for the paving slabs. After the cobblestones and the paving slabs, the most dominant feature on the barricades are the sandbags. There's a hell of a lot of them, and they stretch right the way along the full length to one degree or another. You'll find them in the two removable sections. Even on the truck it's got some sandbags on the underside. So I'm going to keep these nice and bright, with the main colour being medium grey. As always, I'm going to be applying this over a couple of layers and a glaze, as you'll see, before we move on to the highlight. Now I'm going to be careful that I'm not obliterating the shade when I'm painting on here. There's a hell of a lot of tiny little sandbags sculpted on this, and I want to catch the detail as much as possible without sweating too much. You know, I'm not going to intricately paint every single handbag. I am using some fairly broad sweeps with the brush, but I want to make sure I am leaving plenty of shade, and when I come back to do the second coat I will refine that shade so that it is really, really thin lines, like a thin web going throughout the sandbags. We don't want too dark here folks, we want just a tiny amount of dark to give it the shape that we need. Then to soften that shade just a bit, because it's very dark compared to the light of the sandbags, I'm going to do a glaze. Now remember here, a glaze is just something that is going to change the surface colour, it's not a wash. If you're putting it on heavy enough for the paint to sink into the recesses, cover the shade, therefore dominate, then you're doing too much and you've got to draw it off quickly so it doesn't dry. So glaze across all the sandbags and the shade just to soften things down. And for the highlight I'm going to apply some small amounts of deck tan. Now these two colours are fairly similar, so it's not going to be an extremely bold highlight, but it will lighten things. So it's not going to be so much like an edge highlighting we're doing here folks, we're just lightening up the general colour of the sandbags. Don't do too much though, or it will become the main colour of the sandbags, unless of course it is your intention to have them as light as that. After the sandbags, the most common item is going to be all the wooden boxes, crates, lids, all these kind of things that are scattered throughout the barricade. So I'm going to have a common colour to start them all, but take different approaches. In some cases I'm going to have a layering approach, in other cases I'm going to employ a wash and then highlighting. And I'm going to stick to old wood for this layer, folks, so there's a common palette going across the entire piece. And you know, for the layering approach I'm obviously leaving some shade between all the planking and edges and so on, but I'm also making sure that I'm leaving some shade around the areas that I'm going to wash, so there's a defined line between those areas and, for instance, the sandbags and the base itself, like the flagstones and so on, because we need that very fine shade just to give us a shape in such a complex piece. The crates and boxes that I'm going to apply a wash to, I'm going to use German Camo Black Brown. The wooden beams that are there in various lengths, I'm going to apply a wash of flat earth to, so they look a little bit different from the crates. I'm going to use Iraqi sand to highlight all of these wooden items. I'm going to be hitting the edges, going to be hitting the panel lines, whether there's a wash being applied or a layer being left, like a layer of shade. I'm going to take the same approach to both. Iraqi sand is a really bright highlight colour, so you don't want to be applying it too heavily, but it will really help all these individual items just pop out of the background of the larger piece. And we're starting to make some real progress overall now, folks. We've got all the main areas pretty much covered now, so we're going to be working in smaller batches of colour now, smaller areas, smaller items, and perhaps more variety. Now on to the small metallic features. I'm going to be using German Grey as the main colour here, with a highlight of London Grey. The lamppost I will paint in a different colour. I'll start with German Grey as a shade colour, but then the main colour is going to be Luftwaffe uniform, which is quite blue. I'm going to use that same Luftwaffe uniform colour for some of the oil drums, and then for contrast I'm going to use Splinter Camo Base from Panzer Aces on some lighter coloured oil drums. The oil drums that are going to be grey, I've given a base colour, a shade colour of German Grey. The other ones I have just left them with the olive brown base colour, and then I'm going to layer them up, building them up towards a highlight, and then also some rusty streaks. And here you can see me using London Grey to highlight all these darker metallic objects. Now for some rusty elements, so I'm going to start with a wash of Panzer Aces Dark Rust on the spools of wire. You can see here there's several of them across the pieces, and then onto the drums as well, the oil drums. I'm not going to put it over the entire oil drum at this moment, just almost like a shade wash, you know, in the areas where the recesses are. The large metal I-beams, I'm going to first of all give them a shade coat, that's a coat all over of that same dark rust colour. I'll then add a layer of light rust, but this is going to be a very broken, random, patchy kind of layer, as you imagine rust would be. And then on the oil drums, using that same light rust colour, paint some rusty streaks. Then back to these big I-beams with some yellowish rust. Don't use too much of this here, folks. It's a really nice accent colour, but it really starts to take over if you use too much because it is really bright. Now on to the mattresses, and I'm not wanting to leave any of that German Camo black brown shade internally, just want it framed by the shade. So I'm going to give some of them a coat of German Camo Beige World War II and some a coat of deck tan. I'll then layer it up, starting with off-white. Do this in the standard way of layering here, folks. We've got lots of sculpted shapes in the mattresses, so the first layer you apply will map out the shape, map out the sculpt, and then the second layer will just firm everything up, as well as give you a nice solid opaque coat. And then to finish, a little bit of white on the edges, corners and on the high points of the sculpted features. Now let's get those mattresses looking nice and dirty by applying some stains. For the mattress that has been undercoated with deck tan, I'm going to use sort of ochre coloured washes so it's not too stark, but for the darker one I'll use a darker brown coloured wash. Now for the chairs and for the desk, I'm going to layer up from the German Camo black brown, so that's going to be an internal shade in the completed piece, with some flat earth. With the large areas of the desk, it's going to take a couple of coats, remember. The smaller chairs you'll probably get it all done in one coat, and on the desk try and create the illusion of wood grain or planking almost, if you understand. You know, it's not going to be one big solid piece of wood on the sides, back and top. And then just to brighten things up, painting in a fairly streaky kind of way, just as we've built up the layers on the desk so far, I'm going to be using some new wood. There are a few doors on the barricades, and if we paint them with brighter colours, it'll help bring them into focus. You know, these are very large pieces, a few brighter areas catch the eye and just help the whole thing come together. I'm going to use a couple of colours for the doors. Here I'm using green. I've started by giving an all over coat of dark green, that's German Camo dark green, and then any kind of medium coloured green as the main coat, and layer it up, leaving the shade to give shape to all the panels. For the red I'm starting with a shade coat of burnt cadmium red and then just red as the main colour, once again leaving the shade to create the shape of all the panels. Now as a highlight, I'm not going to use a lighter red or green. I'm going to give the impression of exposed wood. You know, these doors have been ripped off, knocked about, chucked in barricades, so they're going to be damaged. So I'm going to use some old wood and just bounce the brush along edges, internal edges, external edges, the peak of the panel shapes, just to bring these shapes out in a nicely weathered way. Each barricade has a large tarpaulin chucked over the top, so we're just going to paint that in my standard layering approach once again, starting with the shade colour that is already there, that's the olive brown. I'm going to layer up, in this case through dark mud and onto a highlight of green grey. One thing I do not appear to have captured here is a little bit of pigment, a little bit of light earth colour that I have placed into all the exposed areas of soil beneath the cobbles and the paving stones. Now this is just a small amount, folks. You'll see me using pigments in other videos. I don't apply very much, just to put it in there to help lighten the area and give it a little bit of a lighter edge as well, you know, where the earth meets the broken edges of the cobbles and the paving stones, brings them into focus quite nicely. And that is us nearly finished now, folks, on a project that really seemed quite daunting to me to begin with. Once I broke it down into little sub projects, it was actually no bother at all. Hopefully you found it interesting, maybe give you a few ideas for your own urban bases. There's a slideshow of pictures coming up at the end of this, folks, so you can see the completed pieces. So it just leaves me to say here, thanks as always for watching. Thanks to the subscribers out there and you folks that just drop into the channel from time to time to see what we're doing. If you'd like to help us grow the channel and bring this kind of content to more people who enjoy painting Flames of War and wargame figures, give us a sub, hit the bell button, and we'll definitely see you all on the next one.